Pamela Phillips was living the high life in Aspen, Colorado.
She went to fancy restaurants,
became a socialite.
Her ex-husband, Gary Triano, on the other hand, was a Tucson real estate tycoon struggling to recover from a string of bad deals.
He was in kind of a downswing.
And on November 1st, 1996, Gary's losing streak went from bad to worse.
A bomb exploded in Gary Triano's car.
We have an assassination.
Had a risky business deal cost him his life?
It was payback.
Folks out of Chicago.
The Russian mafia.
Or would the money trail and a 20-year investigation end up leading the police in an entirely different direction?
You're going to be in prison for murder.
Tucson, Arizona, November 1st, 1996. Although it was only 5:30 in the afternoon, the exclusive La Paloma Country Club was already crowded.
A lot of golfers around. It was a Friday afternoon. It was very busy.
Golf wasn't the only game being played, though. On the links and in the lounge, multi-million-dollar deals were being made.
It was quite expensive to be a member of that country club.
And the stakes were about to get even higher. Out in the parking lot, among the ranks of BMWs, Cadillacs, and Mercedes, a car had just exploded.
Parts of things were flying far out into the street.
A windshield ended up 150 yards away into a pool.
Club staff and members rushed out to see what had happened, and what they found looked like a war zone.
The car was devastated.
The roof of the car had blown off. The doors of the car were blown open.
The driver of the Lincoln Town Car was one of the club's most well-known members, 52-year-old Gary Triano.
He was a mover and shaker. Real estate was his game.
But it appeared to be all over.
Folks that he'd been golfing with saw him get into the car.
When emergency personnel arrived to put out the flames engulfing the car, they confirmed it. Gary had been in the vehicle when it exploded.
There was extensive injury to Mr. Triano.
Part of his hand was no longer there, and he had severe injury to his right thigh and a lot of injury to his face, his head.
It was obvious that Gary was expired, and there wasn't anything they could do.
Gary was dead, and since he was the victim of what appeared to be a car bomb, the implications were obvious.
It would appear from preliminary observation that we have an assassination.
And the search for his assassin would lead the investigators deep into both his multi-million-dollar business deals and his 7-year marriage to a former model turned successful real estate agent in her own right, 39-year-old Pamela Phillips. Born in 1957, Pamela Phillips grew up in Tucson, dreaming of a better life.
People that grew up with her always said that Pam's aspiration in life was to be rich.
And while she might not have grown up rich, she had grown up blonde and beautiful.
She had been a model at one point in time here in Tucson.
But modeling, especially in a market like Tucson, didn't pay the bills. So in her mid-20s, the sometime model turned to a more profitable profession, selling real estate.
It's kind of an easy living sort of place. A lot of people like it.
A whole lot of people. By the time Pamela got into real estate, Arizona was one of the fastest growing states in the nation, and Tucson was booming.
The whole population of Metro Tucson, it's close to 1 million people.
And thanks to Pamela's sunny beauty and sharp business sense, she sold houses to quite a few of them.
She was very well known in the real estate business.
She had a good job. She had her own money.
Although for all of her success, Pamela couldn't compare to the real players in the high-dollar world of Tucson real estate. People like Gary Triano. 14 years older than Pam, by the mid-'80s, Gary had moved beyond selling real estate to developing it. One of dozens of up-and-coming tycoons busy carving subdivisions out of the desert.
And he was well known by a lot of people, kind of a wheeler-dealer kind of guy.
And he had the personality to match.
He's the guy that walked in a room and everybody turned and looked.
If you were with him, you knew you were going to have a good time.
And if someone invested in one of his development deals, they were going to make a lot of money too.
Gary was a very, very aggressive businessman. He was always going to come out ahead.
He made a lot of money.
He was no miser, though. With so much money rolling in, Gary made sure to spread it around.
He was very prominent, a huge supporter of many philanthropic organizations in town.
He's the guy that would tip a server $100.
Gary and his wife were equally famous for the lavish parties they threw at their Tucson home. Huge affairs attended by the movers and shakers in Tucson real estate. It's no surprise that one of those parties was where Pamela first met Gary.
Pamela just liked what she saw.
Not just his money and success either.
He was muscular, he had height, he had stature.
Gary apparently liked what he saw too. Within months of their meeting, he'd left his wife and started dating Pamela.
Pamela came in and basically took him away from his first wife.
Once his divorce was final, Gary and Pamela married in 1986.
I know Gary loved her.
A year later, the couple welcomed their first child, followed by a second in 1990. And by then, Pamela had given up selling real estate and focused on being everything a wealthy developer's wife was supposed to be.
She was very involved with Junior League. She did all the right things, knew the right people in the community.
Even if her definition of the right people rubbed some the wrong way.
She just thought she was better than everybody else. If you didn't have a lot of money, you were beneath her.
And in light of that, some called what happened to Pamela in the 1990s a comeuppance. After years of success, a series of high-dollar deals collapsed, and Gary's high-flying business empire was in free fall.
He was in kind of a downswing at the time.
Suddenly, the jet-setting couple was grounded. And for Pamela, the landing was especially hard.
I can't even imagine being that kind of person. You know, to be living the high life and all of a sudden now you've fallen down that ladder.
The financial setback took a toll on the couple's relationship, too.
The difficulties that they had in their marriage was related to money.
Specifically, Gary's lack of it.
When Gary started having money troubles, that was when she bailed.
In 1993, Pam filed for divorce and for full custody of the couple's 2 children.
His heart was broken. He loved her and he loved his children.
Coupled with his staggering business losses, the divorce was almost too much for Gary to take.
He checked into a facility because he needed some help. He just couldn't get his life in check and he needed to get himself together. And he did. And he came out okay.
But he also came out alone. At the custody hearing, Pamela argued that her children deserved a secure future, free from the ups and downs of Gary's real estate career. And the judge admitted that she had a point.
She had the full custody. He was allowed visitation, weekends and holidays.
The custody finalized, Pamela took the kids and left Tucson, looking to start a new life in a new city.
After the divorce, she moved to Aspen.
And the fact that her new home was practically synonymous with wealth and celebrity wasn't exactly a surprise to Gary's friends back in Tucson.
It wasn't any secret that she loved the power, she loved the money.
A divorce settlement would only go so far, though. So once in Aspen, Pam took up her old career.
She became involved in real estate activity again.
But she spent even more time enjoying the jet-setting lifestyle of the Tony resort town.
She became a socialite.
She went to fancy restaurants and the fancy social club there in Aspen where the more wealthy people hung out.
Although it wasn't all for fun, Pamela's real goal for working the Aspen social circuit was closing a high-dollar deal of her own, one that had nothing to do with real estate.
Pam wanted to develop a lifestyle that was financed by a husband.
But would she have time to find her sugar daddy? because after less than 2 years in Aspen, she was still searching and sizing up the market when a bomb blast threatened to drag her back to Tucson. Coming up, Pamela suggests a shocking source for the bomb.
He had these connections to the mob.
But a chance discovery reveals an entirely different connection.
Found in the van were a lot of notes.
At 5:38 p.m. on November 1st, 1996, a massive explosion rocked the exclusive La Paloma Country Club in Tucson, Arizona.
A lot of 911 calls at that point. No one knew at first what exactly had happened.
But by the time the police arrived on the scene, the cause of the explosion appeared all too clear. A car bomb.
There were parts of the car that were found out on the main roadway outside the country club.
And the driver of the car, a prominent real estate developer named Gary Triano, had been killed instantly.
When the bomb exploded, he had already gotten into his car.
Incredibly, despite the debris scattered across the parking lot, no one else was seriously injured.
The only other significant injury was another man who was parked in the parking lot, actually in a car just adjacent to Mr. Triano's car. He suffered some cuts from broken glass.
While the coroner's personnel removed Gary's body from the remains of his Lincoln, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the Tucson Police Bomb Squad, and agents from the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms moved in to try and determine the nature of the bomb that killed Gary.
There were numerous bomb squads.
It was a sea of law enforcement. Red lights, blue lights, flashing.
And considering the power of the explosion, the search for clues covered a wide area.
There are car parts and other evidence blown across Sunrise, blown on top of buildings.
Roofs were searched, golf courses were searched. It was an exhaustive effort.
While the explosive experts worked, Gary's family and friends reeled from not just the news that he was dead, but also the almost unbelievable way he died.
It's one thing when you die of a heart attack or you die in a car wreck or something, but to be blown to bits, people were devastated.
It was hard to believe a car bomb intentionally set to kill someone.
But that appeared to be the case, more or less. After hours of careful searching, the ATF and bomb squads had recovered enough components to begin reconstructing the device.
It was a pipe bomb.
The investigators had also recovered the shredded remains of the athletic bag the killer had apparently used to conceal the bomb.
He disguised the device to look innocent.
And while Gary was playing golf at the club, it appeared that the killer had somehow placed the device inside the Lincoln.
Walk up to the car and open the door, drop the bag in there, walk back to your car and wait.
And based on the reconstructed remains of the device, the killer had waited.
That this was a remote detonated device.
Which would indicate the person that pushed the button could see the car.
But whose finger had been on the button? Hoping for more information, the investigators spent the next several days contacting Gary's friends and business associates. But what they found out didn't exactly narrow things down.
Gary Triano was a man who angered a lot of people.
According to the people who knew Gary well, the real estate developer had been in a bit of a slump.
He did owe a lot of money.
He was in debt, millions of dollars.
$40 million to be exact. And he had a habit of not paying up.
We learned about numerous lawsuits that were pending.
Numerous was not an understatement either.
He had 100 civil lawsuits against him.
Whether those lawsuits would ever recover the money Gary owed was tough to say. 2 years earlier, in 1994, the developer had filed for bankruptcy.
So from the investigative point of view, there were a lot of people who might have had a motive to kill Gary Triano.
When the investigators spoke to Gary's ex-wife, Pamela Phillips, she suggested that some of the people he owed money to were just the sort to put a hit on Gary. It was soon after the bombing that the investigators contacted Pamela at her home in Aspen, Colorado.
They were trying to gather information from her about what was going on in Gary Triano's life at the time that he was murdered.
According to Pamela, there had been plenty going on, and little of it above board. The 39-year-old told them that Gary had grown increasingly desperate as his debts mounted.
There were Chinese investors, Mexican investors, folks out of Chicago.
There was the innuendo that he had these connections to the mob.
Was it possible one of those connections was behind the bomb that caused Gary's car to explode? That's definitely what Pamela suggested.
It was payback because Gary owed so much money.
And when the investigators followed up back in Tucson, Gary's friends appeared to confirm Pam's sinister theory.
There was some speculation that there was maybe some mob involvement.
Not only that, according to his friends, Gary had grown increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to his death.
Gary Triano was telling people, I think I'm being followed.
He was visibly kind of disheveled. He was nervous.
But he hadn't been nervous enough to change his routine, though.
Mr. Triano had a habit of golfing on Friday afternoon. So his business associates, his friends, everybody knew that's where you would find Gary on Friday afternoon.
Including, as it turned out, his killer. But who was that killer? And could the investigators tie the bomber to some shady business deal? So far, the answer was no.
We weren't getting anything about anybody seen suspicious at the scene.
But then, in mid-November, the Pima County Sheriff's Department got a call that made them very suspicious, mostly because it just happened to come from Pamela's new hometown of Aspen. The caller, an investigator with the Aspen Police Department, explained that he had been working what appeared to be an unrelated case.
He was investigating a man by the name of Ron Young in connection with a fraud in the Aspen area.
Specifically, Ron had been posing as a financial counselor and preying on wealthy Aspen residents.
He would approach you and say, I'll develop your venture capital. Basically, what we'll do is if you let me run your finances, you'll make more money.
But according to the detective, Ron had actually been running an elaborate scam.
He would get complete control of your financial structure, issue himself credit cards in your name, and start living off of your money.
And back in April, 7 months before Gary Triano's murder, the Aspen authorities had been ready to bring the con man in.
Aspen police had obtained an arrest warrant.
But when the police tried to take Ron into custody, they discovered that the con man had skipped town in a stolen van.
Ron Young had rented an Avis van and he never returned it.
Although the police did eventually find it in October of 1996.
The van was found parked in Yorba Linda, California.
In addition to the van, Ron had left a lot of other things behind, too.
What was found in the van were a lot of notes,
documents, maps.
But it wasn't until the bombing in Tucson that the police in Aspen realized the significance of all those papers. Because every single one of those notes, documents, and maps pertained to Pamela Phillips' ex-husband. Coming up, will Ron Young lead the police to Pamela?
There was a romantic relationship.
Or will they be too late?
Switzerland will not allow extradition.
By mid-November 1996, it had been 2 weeks since Pamela Phillips' ex-husband had been murdered outside a Tucson, Arizona country club. But the whole city was still talking about the spectacular crime.
A pipe bomb exploded in Gary Triano's car, ripping the roof off the car and killing him.
And since Gary was a wealthy real estate developer with a recent run of bad luck, Tucson was buzzing with speculation about a mob hit.
The rumors were amazing. I mean, everything from the Russian mafia to people he owed a lot of money to, and he did owe a lot of money.
Whether it was mobsters or disgruntled business partners, the long list of potential suspects wasn't making things easy for the authorities.
There were business associates anywhere from Florida, Chicago, China, Mexico.
But then the Tucson investigators received an unexpected tip from a police detective in Aspen, Colorado. He told the investigators he had been working a case involving a con artist by the name of Ron Young.
He had an arrest warrant out for Ron Young in connection with a fraud in the Aspen area.
So far, Young had escaped arrest, fleeing Aspen in a stolen van. But in October of 1996, almost a month before the explosion that killed Gary Triano, California police had recovered the van. And inside, they had found shocking evidence that tied Ron Young to the dead man.
There's notes about intimate details of Gary's life. There's a map of Tucson, notes about people that Gary associated with.
They also found evidence that Ron had been in Tucson in the weeks before the bombing.
A receipt for a hotel, which is halfway between where Gary was living and La Paloma Country Club.
Add it all up, and the evidence was unmistakable.
Ron Young had spent some time stalking Gary Triano.
After almost 2 weeks of wild rumors, the investigators had just found their first real lead.
We believe he's implicated in this murder case.
And since Ron had been based in Aspen, the fact that he was implicated raised some complicated questions about Gary's ex-wife, Pamela Phillips.
She lived in Aspen at the time that the bombing occurred.
And that wasn't just a coincidence either. According to the Aspen detective, Pam and Ron knew one another. When Pam first moved to Colorado after the divorce, she and Ron had been neighbors.
They began some sort of a friendship, and it seems to have started where Mr. Young was giving Pam Phillips financial advice.
But as time went on, discussions between the con man and the divorcee had turned from financial advice to something far more intimate.
There was a romantic relationship between Pamela Phillips and Ron Young.
We have witnesses that talk about Ron spending the night, long evenings in front of the fireplace, curled up with each other.
The relationship had lasted until Ron skipped town with a van full of papers pertaining to Gary. But did that mean Pamela was in on the murder? Working with their counterparts in Aspen, the Tucson investigators shifted their focus to Gary's ex-wife. In the 2 years since moving to Aspen, Pamela had been enjoying everything the upscale resort town had to offer.
People described her as being somewhat of a socialite.
And as far as her Aspen friends knew, she could afford it.
She was working as a realtor.
But when the investigators took a closer look at Pamela's finances, they discovered that the 39-year-old wasn't doing nearly as well as she'd led her new friends to believe.
She was living off of about $250,000 that she was able to walk away from Tucson with, from selling their home in Tucson.
Although in a Tony resort town like Aspen, $250,000 wouldn't go far.
Aspen is an extremely expensive place to live.
And after almost 2 years there, Pamela's money was running out.
She was down to her last $60,000.
She blew through the money.
But did that mean she was behind the plot that blew up Gary? Her connection to Ron Young certainly suggested it. And so did her need for cash, once the investigators discovered that Gary had been insured for a total of $2 million. The policy didn't name Pamela as the direct beneficiary.
The policy was taken out for the benefit of the children.
But with the oldest only 9, Gary had to appoint a trustee to control the money until the children turned 18.
Pam Phillips was the trustee.
However, despite her strong motive and her suspicious connection to Ron Young, the investigators couldn't make an arrest.
I certainly had no evidence that directly linked her.
To prove that Pamela was behind the bombing, the Pima County authorities needed the man they believed had planted it.
The big missing piece was this person, Ron Young.
He had fallen off the face of the earth. No one could find him.
After ditching the van that clued the police in on his potential connection to Gary's murder, Ron's trail had gone completely cold. And by November of 1997, a year after Gary's death, the investigation into his murder was just as cold.
The case was open and active, but there wasn't a lot of activity going on.
Not on the part of the police, at least. Pamela, on the other hand, was suddenly very busy and very rich.
Within 3 months of the murder, the insurance company paid out a little over $2 million to Pam Phillips.
And with the money to finance her socialite lifestyle in Aspen, Pamela had finally found herself a new sugar daddy.
She was dating a very wealthy gentleman. They were like one step away from engagement.
But would she fulfill her longtime goal of marrying money? In November of 2005, 9 years after the bomb that killed Gary, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, ATF, and Aspen Police arranged for Ron Young to be featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted.
An episode mostly talking about the fraud investigation, but also bringing up various aspects of the Triano murder,
including enough about Pamela's suspected involvement to give her future fiancé some serious second thoughts.
Upon the airing of the America's Most Wanted show, he separated all ties to her.
More importantly for the Tucson authorities, the day after the episode aired, they received an urgent phone call from a Fort Lauderdale, Florida chiropractor.
Ron Young is going to be in my office.
Ron Young is living in Fort Lauderdale under an assumed name.
And when Ron arrived for his chiropractic appointment the next day, he was arrested for the almost 10-year-old fraud warrant.
He didn't resist or anything like that.
He didn't admit any guilt either.
He denies any involvement with Gary Triano's death.
But when the authorities searched his apartment, they found what appeared to be a wealth of evidence.
They found floppy disks, zip disks, the hard drive to his computer.
There's a bunch of microcassettes.
And when officers popped one of those tapes into a player,
they heard the voice of Pamela Phillips.
Hi, I need to talk to you.
He kept meticulous records of phone conversations, audio recordings, and emails between the two of them back and forth.
They discussed the money that was owed by Miss Phillips to Ron Young.
A $400,000 obligation on the part of Pam Phillips.
And the former real estate agent had been paying it off like a mortgage, slowly, over time.
Miss Phillips had been surreptitiously sending money to Ron Young every month in small amounts, $1,500, $2,000 every couple of weeks.
I mailed what I had.
But what was the money for? As far as the cops were concerned, it was no mystery.
For the purpose of Ron Young killing Gary Triano.
However, throughout the hours of conversations, Ron and Pamela had been careful. In fact, the only time either of them came close to saying what the money was for came near the end of the tapes, when she started trying to weasel out of paying up.
I'm not able to send you any more money. I can't. I just can't.
And when Ron called her back, he had slipped up in anger, finally revealing just what would happen if Pamela didn't pay.
But you're going to be in prison for murder.
After almost 10 years, the police believed they had the proof they needed.
The tapes were damning. This was money for the hit.
The prosecutors spent the next 2.5 years making sure their case was as airtight as possible.
This is a massive case. There's only, I believe, over 400,000 pages of just paper.
And in 2008, the prosecutors finally presented their massive case to the grand jury.
Pamela Phillips was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder.
But had they waited too long? When the investigators showed up at Pamela's Aspen home with an arrest warrant, she wasn't there.
But she's left the country.
She'd gone to Switzerland, only this time she wasn't shopping for a wealthy boyfriend.
Switzerland will not allow extradition if it's a death penalty case.
Pamela couldn't avoid arrest entirely, but her shrewd move did force the prosecutor's hand.
In order to effectuate the extradition, we had to agree that we would not seek the death penalty against Pam Phillips.
It wasn't until December 3rd, 2009, more than a decade after Gary's death, that Pam was finally arrested for his murder.
She was arrested by Interpol, and she was held there for a period of time before she was extradited back to the United States.
And when she arrived at the Tucson airport on July 2nd, 2010, handcuffed and under police escort, it was hard to even recognize the former Aspen socialite.
She looked disheveled. She had no makeup.
She didn't appear too happy to be back in Arizona either.
How does it feel to be back in Tucson? Feels a little warm.
And it was about to get even warmer.
When I saw her on TV, it was just a really joyful day for me, because I knew that they finally had her and that justice would be served.
Coming up, at trial, the defense claims there was no murder plot.
He was extorting money from her.
But will a surprise witness say otherwise?
She said, "Oh my gosh, she actually did it."
On February 19, 2014, Aspen socialite Pamela Phillips finally stood trial for her ex-husband's murder. It had been 5 years since her arrest in Europe, 6 years since she'd fled the country, and almost 18 years since Gary Triano had been killed outside a Tucson country club. But the crime was far from forgotten.
The very public and dramatic way in which Gary Triano was killed, using a pipe bomb in his car, made the case something that grabbed the public's attention.
The man who planted that bomb was already in prison. Ron Young had been convicted of murder in March of 2010.
The prosecution's perspective was that he was the hitman, that he was getting payment for killing Gary Triano.
According to the prosecution's opening statement, Pamela had plotted her ex-husband's death in order to get her hands on $2 million worth of life insurance.
Pamela Phillips was the only one that benefited from the death of Gary Triano.
That life insurance policy was just dangling in front of her, and she went for it.
And since her boyfriend Ron Young was already wanted for fraud and desperate for the cash to start a new life, the prosecutors claimed it hadn't been hard for Pamela to convince him to carry out the murder.
There was an agreement between Ron and Pam. Hey, if Gary dies, I get $2 million. I'll give you $400,000. That can start a new life for you.
So according to the prosecutors, Ron had spent weeks stalking his victim, and then on November 1st, 1996, detonated a remote-controlled bomb that he had planted in Gary's car.
From all appearances, Mr. Triano had gotten into the driver's seat, had reached over, and as he reached over, the bomb went off.
And the prosecutors claimed that it was no coincidence that soon after that bomb went off, Pamela had started paying Ron off.
She was sending him $1,500 on one week and then $1,800 a week following that.
Being able to show that financial connection was very critical.
It was also easy, thanks to the meticulous records Ron had kept.
The phone calls, the emails were much of what we relied on at trial to show that there had been this financial relationship between the two of them.
However, while the hours of phone calls and hundreds of emails Ron saved did show a clear financial relationship, they didn't quite add up to a murder confession.
There were no direct admissions on these phone conversations.
They never came right out and said it.
All told, the word murder came up only once, when Ron lost his temper in an argument and appeared to threaten Pamela, suggesting what would happen to her if she failed to pay.
You're going to be in prison for murder.
That was the only time murder came up in the tapes. But was it the only time Pamela had discussed killing Gary? On February 27th, the prosecutors called a woman named Laura to the stand. A wealthy Tucson resident, Laura had known Pamela Phillips for more than 20 years.
She testified that she was good friends with Pamela.
And she testified that she had been one of Pamela's closest confidants during her divorce from Gary. A divorce that, according to Laura, had more than its share of nastiness.
There was a lot of fighting in court and out of court.
Including one fight whose aftermath Laura claimed to remember vividly.
Gary had come over to the house, had been pretty rough with Pamela.
When he left, according to Laura, Pamela had called her in tears, so she and another friend had rushed straight to Pamela's.
They came over and were trying to calm her down.
But as it turned out, Pamela hadn't been frightened. Laura said she had been furious.
Clearly, Phillips had gotten to the point where she hated Triano.
And according to Laura, Pamela said she had decided to do something about it.
She said, I should just have him killed.
Miss Phillips told her that she could easily hire someone to have him taken out, that his golf game was so predictable that he'd easily be found.
Laura told the court that at the time, she dismissed Pamela's plotting, figuring her friend was simply blowing off steam.
She didn't think a lot of the statement.
But then, on November 1st, 1996, she had realized that Pam had been dead serious.
When she heard Gary Triano had been killed, she said to her husband, "Oh my gosh, she actually did it."
So why hadn't Laura come forward then? Why keep the secret almost 20 years?
Her answer is because after Gary died, we realized if she could kill him, she could kill us.
She feared for her life.
Would the jury find her claims convincing? The defense certainly didn't. On cross, they argued with the case once again in the news. There was another far more obvious and less incriminating reason that she had come forward.
The defense tried to suggest that maybe she was confabulating her real memories with things she had read in the newspapers.
And when the defense started presenting its case, they claimed that even if Pamela had been angry at Gary, and even if she had said those things, that still didn't mean she was involved in his murder. And neither was Ron Young. According to the defense, the whole thing was an elaborate con.
They portrayed Ronald Young as a con man who was ripping off Pamela Phillips.
And the emails, voicemails, and financial records that Ron had so meticulously and inexplicably saved, according to the defense, they were all part of his scheme to extort Pamela.
They're explaining the payments that Pamela Phillips was making to Ron Young as really extortion payments.
But if Pam and Ron hadn't killed Gary, then who had? The defense claimed that the state had overlooked the most obvious answer of all, the one Pamela had first given them almost 20 years ago.
The defense at trial wanted to portray him as having some mob ties.
And when Gary's business had gone south and he couldn't pay back the money he'd borrowed, Gary had paid with his life.
It was a scorned business associate of Gary Triano's that had him killed.
After almost 20 years, would the rumors that circulated after Gary's death be enough to get Pamela off a murder charge? As the case went to the jury, the prosecutors and police couldn't rule out the possibility.
We have no eyewitness. We have no physical evidence.
Coming up, the prosecutors brace themselves as the verdict is read.
Whether or not we had enough, that was our concern.
But Pamela appears confident.
She would just look at the camera and do this smile.
On April 8, 2014, 55-year-old Pamela Phillips sat in a Tucson, Arizona courtroom looking every bit the Aspen socialite.
Pamela Phillips would spend a period of time in a room adjacent to the courtroom getting ready for court every morning.
But for the last 2 months, the state had been trying to convince the jury that the former real estate agent had planned the sensational 1996 murder of her ex-husband, Gary Triano, killed by a bomb that detonated in his car outside Tucson's most exclusive country club.
Pamela Phillips stood to gain $2 million from an insurance policy.
They portrayed her as selfish and manipulative and that she was someone who wanted wealth above all else.
According to the prosecution, Pamela had hired her ex-boyfriend Ron Young to put the bomb in her ex-husband's car in exchange for a cut of the insurance money.
They continued to live off of the benefits of the murder for the next 14 years.
But despite a clear trail of financial transactions and communication between the two, the prosecutors still didn't have any physical evidence that tied Pamela to the murder.
We were concerned about the circumstantial nature of our case. We felt absolutely we had the right person, but whether or not we had enough circumstantial evidence to convict, that was our concern going into deliberations.
The defense had made the most of that weakness, too, suggesting that one of Gary's many disgruntled business partners was behind the murder.
He did owe a lot of money, and there were people who were suing him.
But who would the jurors believe? When the jury filed in to read the verdict, the only person in the courtroom who appeared confident was Pamela Phillips.
She would just look at the camera and do this smile.
But would her smile still be there once the verdict was read?
We find the defendant, Pamela Ann Phillips, guilty of first-degree murder.
She had this look like, I don't believe this. And in fact, she shook her head like, no.
She couldn't believe that this had happened, that she was convicted.
For Gary's family and friends, their almost 20-year wait for justice was finally over.
You could hear a sigh of relief from the Triano family.
No high-fiving, no cheering, but just like it's over.
And on May 22nd, 2014, Pamela Phillips was sentenced to life in prison. And while the Arizona prison system is a far cry from Aspen, Pamela got what she had always wanted. She's set for life.
She killed somebody for money, and she just destroyed a lot of lives. She'll get to spend the rest of her life in jail.
Northern Italy, late summer, 1977. On the surface, life moved at its usual pace. The cafes opened each morning. Church bells echoed through ancient streets. Families gathered around dinner tables as they had for generations. In cities like Verona, Padua, Venice, Vicenza, and Milan, few people could have imagined that a shadow was beginning to spread across the region, a shadow that would linger for nearly 7 years. At first, it seemed like a single act of brutality. A man named Garino Spinelli was sleeping inside a small Fiat 126 in Verona. He was a member of the Roma community and struggled with drug addiction. On the night of August 25th, 1977, his life ended in unimaginable horror when Molotov cocktails were thrown into the vehicle. Trapped inside, he was burned alive. The crime shocked investigators. It was cruel, deliberate, personal, and yet there appeared to be no obvious motive that could explain the sheer brutality of what had happened. The case entered police records as another violent homicide. Tragic, certainly. Disturbing, without question. But nobody knew that this murder would later be recognized as the beginning of one of the most bizarre and terrifying criminal sagas in modern Italian history. Because Garino Spinelli would not be the last. Not even close. Over the following years, more victims would emerge. A restaurant worker connected to a gay establishment. A young drug user. A sex worker. Priests. People from entirely different backgrounds. People who lived different lives. People who had never met one another. At first glance, they seemed to share nothing in common. Different cities, different ages, different professions, different circumstances. Yet somehow, they were all being selected by the same invisible force. As the body count grew, investigators faced a troubling question. Were these isolated crimes? Or was somebody hunting specific kinds of people? The answer would arrive not through a witness, a confession, or a breakthrough in forensic science. Instead, it would arrive through messages. Messages left behind by the killers. Messages that transformed a series of murders into something far more frightening. At crime scenes and in communications linked to the attacks, investigators began encountering symbols and declarations that suggested ideology rather than impulse. There were references to Nazism. There were swastikas. There were statements proclaiming moral judgment. Among the most chilling messages were declarations such as, "We are the last Nazis," and "Death to those who betray God." Suddenly, the murders no longer appeared random. They appeared purposeful, calculated, driven by a worldview that divided humanity into categories of worth and unworthiness. The name attached to these declarations was equally unsettling. Ludwig. No surname. No explanation. Just one word. Ludwig. The name quickly became a source of fascination and fear. Who or what was Ludwig? Was it a single serial killer? A secret extremist organization? A neo-Nazi terrorist cell? A religious cult? An underground network operating across northern Italy? The public had no answers. Neither at first did law enforcement. As newspapers reported each new attack, speculation intensified. The uncertainty itself became part of the terror. People fear what they can see, but they often fear what they cannot see even more. And Ludwig was invisible. No face, no photograph, no known identity. Only victims, only violence, only cryptic messages. As the years passed, the crimes became increasingly difficult to ignore. The victims were not selected from one profession or one social circle. Instead, they appeared to come from groups that society often pushed to its margins. Drug users, homosexuals, sex workers, homeless individuals, certain members of the clergy. To many observers, the selection of victims seemed deeply ideological. The murders appeared to be acts of judgment carried out by someone who believed they possessed the authority to decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die. That realization made the situation even more disturbing. Because murder motivated by personal anger is one thing. Murder motivated by an entire belief system is something else entirely. A person driven by hatred toward one individual may eventually stop. A person driven by ideology can convince themselves that their violence is a moral obligation. And that is exactly what appeared to be happening. Each new attack reinforced the impression that Ludwig was pursuing a mission. The killers were not seeking money. They were not robbing banks. They were not kidnapping for ransom. Instead, they seemed determined to punish people whom they considered morally corrupt. Their victims were transformed into symbols, targets, examples, warnings. And as long as that mission continued, anyone who fit the killer's twisted definition of corruption could potentially become the next victim. For communities across northern Italy, this possibility created an atmosphere of uncertainty unlike anything they had experienced before. The threat did not belong to one neighborhood. It did not belong to one city. It moved. It evolved. It adapted. The attacks crossed geographic boundaries. One crime scene would emerge in Verona, another in Padua, another in Venice, another in Vicenza, still another in Milan. The map itself seemed to be expanding. Meanwhile, authorities struggled to construct a clear profile of the perpetrators. Traditional criminal investigations often begin with motive. But Ludwig offered too many possible motives. Political extremism, religious fanaticism, hatred, vigilantism, terrorism. Every new crime appeared to raise as many questions as it answered. Then the violence escalated further. The murders were horrifying enough, but eventually Ludwig moved beyond targeting individuals. The attacks began threatening large groups of people at once. The possibility of mass casualties transformed public concern into genuine fear. The question was no longer whether Ludwig would kill again. The question was how many people might die next. By the early 1980s, the mysterious name had become synonymous with terror. Parents worried. Police departments coordinated information. Journalists searched for clues. Citizens followed every development. Yet despite the attention, Ludwig remained hidden. The name existed everywhere. The people behind it existed nowhere. At least, nowhere visible. This disconnect fueled countless theories. Perhaps Ludwig was an organized movement. Perhaps it consisted of multiple killers. Perhaps it had supporters scattered across the country. The crime seemed too ambitious, too widespread, too deliberate. Many found it difficult to believe that only one or two individuals could be responsible. And yet the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove stranger than many of the theories that preceded it. Because behind the terrifying mythology of Ludwig stood neither a vast conspiracy nor a secret army. There was no underground organization directing operations from the shadows. There was no international network, no hidden legion, no criminal empire. Instead, investigators would eventually identify two men. Two young men. Two men whose backgrounds appeared almost incompatible with the horrors attributed to Ludwig. They were educated. They came from respectable families. They were not products of violent streets or organized crime syndicates. To outsiders, they appeared ordinary, perhaps even promising. Yet according to investigators and later court proceedings, these two individuals will become the faces behind one of Italy's most infamous campaigns of ideological violence. Their names were Wolfgang Abel and Marco Ferlin. For years, they allegedly operated beneath the mask of Ludwig. For years, they left behind fear, death, and unanswered questions. For years, northern Italy searched for a monster. What investigators ultimately discovered was something even more unsettling. The monster was not hiding in the darkness. It had been walking through ordinary life all along. And that is where our story begins. To understand the story of Ludwig, it is necessary to look beyond the crimes themselves. Murder investigations often focus on what happened, where it happened, and who committed the act. But some cases demand a deeper question. Why? Why were certain people chosen? Why did the victims appear so different from one another? And how did two young men eventually come to see themselves as judges, juries, and executioners? The answers begin in northern Italy during the late 1970s. This was a period of social change throughout Europe. Traditional values, modern lifestyles, political tensions, and cultural conflicts often existed side by side. Communities that had once seemed stable were adapting to new realities. Debates about morality, religion, identity, and social behavior were becoming increasingly visible. Against this backdrop, two young men met and developed a friendship that would later become infamous. Their names were Wolfgang Abel and Marco Ferlin. According to later investigations, the two first became acquainted while attending high school in the Verona region. On paper, neither appeared destined for a future associated with serial murder, ideological violence, or terrorism. Both came from relatively privileged backgrounds. Both were educated. Both had opportunities that many people never receive. Neither fit the public image of a career criminal. This fact would become one of the most disturbing elements of the Ludwig case. Society often finds comfort in stereotypes. There's a tendency to believe that violent offenders must somehow appear different from everyone else, that there should be visible warning signs, that danger should be easy to recognize. But the Ludwig investigation challenged those assumptions. According to investigators, Abel and Ferlin were not outsiders looking in. They were members of the society they later claimed to judge. As authorities reconstructed their beliefs and motivations, a troubling picture began to emerge. The pair allegedly saw themselves as participants in a mission, not a criminal enterprise, not a money-making scheme, a mission. They believed certain categories of people represented moral corruption. In their worldview, some individuals were supposedly responsible for the decline of society. Investigators concluded that the pair viewed themselves as agents of purification, people tasked with removing those they considered undesirable. It is important to emphasize that these beliefs reflected the ideology attributed to the offenders, not objective reality. The victims had done nothing to deserve what happened to them. Yet within the distorted framework allegedly embraced by Abel and Ferlin, entire groups of human beings were reduced to labels. Drug users, homosexuals, sex workers, homeless individuals, certain priests. The diversity of these groups reveals something important. The offenders were not targeting people because of personal disputes. Most victims were strangers. Instead, the victims were selected because they belonged to categories that Ludwig had chosen to condemn. This process of reducing people to categories is often present in ideological violence. Once individuals stop being seen as human beings and begin to be viewed merely as symbols, violence becomes easier for extremists to justify. The victims of Ludwig never had the opportunity to defend themselves against these judgments. Many never even knew they had been selected. They simply encountered individuals who had already decided that their lives possessed less value. That reality makes the victims central to this story. Too often, notorious criminal cases become focused entirely on the perpetrators. Names, photographs, and biographies of offenders dominate public attention while victims fade into the background. But the story of Ludwig cannot be understood without remembering the people whose lives were destroyed. The first known victim was Garino Spinelli. What survives in the public record is limited. He was a member of the Roma community. He struggled with drug addiction. And on August 25, 1977, he became the first known person killed in what would later be identified as the Ludwig series. Those facts alone tell us very little about who he was as a person. Like every victim in this case, he existed beyond the labels attached to him. He had experiences, relationships, memories, moments of joy and disappointment. Yet history often remembers him only because of the way he died. That tragedy repeats itself throughout many true crime cases. A life becomes condensed into a few lines in a police file. A human being becomes a victim number. And so in discussing Ludwig, it is important to remember that each name represented an entire life, not merely a crime scene. The same can be said of Luciano Stefanato. According to available information, Stefanato worked at a restaurant associated with the gay community in Padua. That connection was apparently enough to place him within Ludwig's ideological crosshairs. On December 17, 1978, he was murdered in an extraordinarily violent attack. Again, the public record preserves details about the crime far more clearly than details about the man himself. This imbalance is common in notorious criminal investigations. Violence attracts attention. Ordinary life rarely does. Yet before becoming a victim, Luciano Stefanato was simply a person living his life. A worker, a member of a community, someone who almost certainly expected to see another day. The same pattern continued with Claudio Costa. Costa was 22 years old, a young man. According to the information linked to the case, he struggled with drug use. Within Ludwig's ideology, that fact transformed him into a target. Within reality, it simply made him a human being facing personal difficulties. The distinction matters. The offenders viewed categories. The victims were individuals. On December 12, 1979, Costa became another name added to the growing list of Ludwig victims. As the murders accumulated, investigators slowly began to recognize a recurring theme. The victims were not connected to one another, but they were connected through the offender's perception of morality. Every selection appeared intentional. Every murder seemed designed to communicate a message. That message became even clearer with the killing of Alice Maria Beretta. Beretta worked as a sex worker in Vicenza. Like many victims throughout history, she belonged to a profession that often exists at society's margins. People in vulnerable circumstances frequently become targets because offenders believe their deaths will attract less attention or sympathy. Yet when examining the Ludwig case, one fact becomes impossible to ignore. The killers were not targeting people because nobody cared about them. They were targeting them precisely because they symbolized categories the offenders hated. Alice Maria Beretta became one of the most brutally murdered victims associated with Ludwig. Her death reflected the increasing violence that characterized the group's activities. What began as murder was evolving into something even darker. The offenders were becoming more confident, more extreme, more convinced of their own righteousness. And when people become convinced that violence serves a higher purpose, the danger often escalates rapidly. The next victims demonstrated just how far that escalation would go. At first glance, priests would seem like unlikely targets. Many observers could understand, at least within the twisted logic of the offenders, why drug users or sex workers had been selected. But religious figures? The inclusion of priests confused investigators and the public alike. Then authorities eventually concluded that Ludwig's ideology extended even into religion itself. The offenders allegedly believed certain priests had betrayed religious principles. As a result, they viewed them as enemies rather than spiritual leaders. This expansion of potential targets revealed something significant. The offenders were no longer simply attacking people on the margins of society. They were attacking anyone who failed to meet their increasingly rigid standards. On July 20th, 1982, two priests of the Monte Berico Sanctuary in Vicenza were murdered. The attack shocked Italy. Religious institutions have long occupied a special place within Italian society, and violence against clergy carried enormous symbolic weight. Yet the killings did not stop there. On February 26, 1983, Father Armando Bison became another victim. His murder would later be remembered as one of the most disturbing crimes associated with Ludwig, because of its grotesque religious symbolism. For many observers, the killing demonstrated the complete contradiction at the heart of the offender's worldview. They claimed to defend morality, yet they committed acts of extraordinary cruelty. They invoked religion, yet they carried out brutal murders. They spoke of righteousness, yet they left behind devastation and grief. This contradiction would remain one of the defining features of the Ludwig case. The offenders presented themselves as guardians of values. Their actions revealed only violence. As investigators continued examining the pattern of victims, another realization emerged. The murders were becoming more ambitious, more dangerous. The offenders appeared increasingly willing to cause large-scale harm. The ideological mission that began with individual victims was expanding. And when extremist beliefs expand unchecked, the number of potential victims expands as well. This transformation would eventually culminate in attacks that threatened dozens of lives simultaneously. But before investigators could understand the full scope of Ludwig's activities, they first needed to answer a fundamental question. Who exactly was hiding behind the mysterious name? At this stage, The answer remained unknown. The public knew Ludwig only through headlines, crime scenes, and fear. The name itself had become larger than any individual. It represented uncertainty, violence, mystery, and a growing sense that somebody was carrying out a private war against people they believed did not deserve to exist. For nearly 7 years, that war would continue. And with each new victim, the distance between Ludwig's self-proclaimed mission and the reality of human suffering became impossible to ignore. Because behind every ideological slogan stood a grieving family. Behind every declaration of moral judgment stood a dead victim. And behind every attempt to justify violence stood the same undeniable truth. Human beings were being murdered. The names changed. The cities changed. The circumstances changed. But the outcome remained the same. Lives ended. Families suffered. Communities mourned. And somewhere in northern Italy, the people calling themselves Ludwig continued searching for their next target. If the name Ludwig became one of the most feared words in northern Italy during the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was because the violence never seemed to follow a predictable path. The victims were different. The locations varied. The methods changed. Yet beneath those differences, investigators would later identify a consistent thread, an ideology that classified certain human beings as unworthy of life. The story of Ludwig is not merely the story of a murder series. It is the story of escalation. What began with the killing of a single vulnerable individual eventually evolved into attacks, capable of killing dozens of people at once. Each crime pushed the boundaries further. Each attack revealed growing confidence. And each victim became another step in a progression that authorities struggled to stop. The first known chapter began on a summer night in Verona, August 25, 1977. At that moment, nobody knew that history would later identify the event as the beginning of the Ludwig case. To investigators responding to the scene, it was simply a horrifying homicide. To the victim, it was the final night of his life. Garino Spinelli was asleep inside a small Fiat 126. The compact vehicle offered little protection from the outside world. Sometime during the night, Molotov cocktails were thrown into the car. The attack was not impulsive. The use of incendiary devices required preparation. Someone had arrived intending to set a fire. Someone had chosen a target. Someone had decided that the person inside would not be allowed to escape. Within moments, the vehicle became a trap. Flames spread rapidly through the confined space. For Spinelli, there was nowhere to run. The attack ended with one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. He was burned alive. The brutality of the murder immediately stood out. Even experienced investigators understood that this was not an ordinary act of violence. Yet despite the horror of the crime, the larger significance remained hidden. No one yet knew they were looking at the first known victim of a future serial murder campaign. More than a year would pass before the next confirmed killing. On December 17, 1978, another victim entered the story. His name was Luciano Stefanato. Stefanato worked in a restaurant associated with the gay community in Padua. According to later investigations, this connection was enough to attract the attention of Ludwig. The attack against him was exceptionally violent. He was stabbed more than 30 times. 30 separate wounds. 30 separate acts of violence directed toward a single human being. The number itself suggests something beyond simple homicide. Such attacks often communicate rage, obsession, or ideological hatred. Investigators would later note another disturbing detail. After Stefanato was dead, a knife was reportedly left embedded in his back. The act appeared symbolic. The killers were not merely ending a life. They seemed determined to send a message. At the time, however, The connection between the Stefanato murder and the death of Guerino Spinelli remained unclear. The victims belonged to different social groups. The methods were different. One victim had been burned alive. The other had been stabbed repeatedly. The apparent lack of connection complicated the investigation. Authorities could not yet see the larger pattern. Meanwhile, whoever stood behind Ludwig continued operating. Another year passed. Then another young man became a victim. December 12, 1979. Venice. The victim was 22-year-old Claudio Costa. Like Spinelli, Costa struggled with drug addiction. Within the worldview later attributed to Ludwig, drug users represented one of the categories deemed unacceptable. To the offenders, addiction apparently became justification for murder. To everyone else, Costa was simply another human being whose life ended violently. The attack itself followed the same ideological logic visible in previous crimes. After the murder, Ludwig reportedly described the killing as punishment for behavior they considered morally wrong. That statement revealed something important. The offenders did not view themselves as criminals. They viewed themselves as judges. This distinction is crucial. Most murderers understand that society considers their actions wrong. The individuals behind Ludwig appeared to believe the opposite. They portrayed themselves as defenders of morality. They acted as though their victims had somehow earned death. Such thinking often represents one of the most dangerous forms of extremism because it allows violence to be framed as virtue. Every attack becomes a righteous act. Every victim becomes an enemy. Every murder becomes a duty. And when killers convince themselves they are performing a duty, there is often no natural limit to their violence. The next murder demonstrated exactly how far that violence could go. December 20th, 1980. Vicenza. The victim was Alice Maria Beretta. Beretta worked as a sex worker. Again, she belonged to a category Ludwig allegedly considered morally corrupt. Again, the selection appeared ideological. Again, the violence was extreme. This time, the killers used an axe and a hammer. The attack became one of the bloodiest murders associated with the Ludwig name. Details like these deeply disturbed the Italian public. The brutality seemed disproportionate even within the context of homicide. The violence communicated contempt. It communicated hatred. Most importantly, it communicated certainty. The offenders appeared completely convinced that they possessed the authority to determine who should live and who should die. By this stage, several murders had occurred across different locations. Authorities increasingly suspected that some form of connection existed. Yet, identifying the perpetrators remained extraordinarily difficult. The victims still appeared unrelated. The methods varied. The geographical spread complicated investigative efforts. And while the public searched for explanations, Ludwig continued evolving. The next phase of violence surprised even those who believed they understood the killer's motives. Until this point, the victims largely fit categories society might associate with Ludwig's self-proclaimed moral crusade. Then the offenders turned their attention toward religious figures. The shift was shocking. Priests seemed like unlikely targets for individuals claiming to defend moral values. Yet Ludwig's worldview apparently extended even into religion. According to later findings, the offenders believed certain clergy members had betrayed religious principles. As a result, they became targets. On July 20th, 1982, violence struck the Monte Berico Sanctuary in Vicenza. 2 priests were murdered. The attack was carried out using a hammer. The crime shocked both religious communities and the broader Italian public. Places of worship are often viewed as symbols of safety and spiritual refuge. Violence within such spaces carries particular emotional weight. The murders at Monte Barrico suggested that Ludwig's ideological standards were becoming increasingly rigid. The offenders were no longer targeting only society's marginalized groups. Now, they were targeting anyone they perceived as violating their worldview. The list of potential victims was expanding, and that expansion made the threat even more frightening. If Ludwig's standards could shift so dramatically, who might become a target next? The answer arrived several months later. February 26, 1983. Trento. The victim was Father Armando Bison. Among all crimes linked to Ludwig, his murder remains one of the most disturbing. The killing involved grotesque religious symbolism. According to investigative findings, a large nail was driven into Father Bison's head. A crucifix was then attached to the murder weapon. The symbolism transformed the homicide into something resembling a ritualized statement. For many observers, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. The offenders invoked religion, yet they committed acts of extraordinary cruelty. They claimed moral superiority, yet they inflicted suffering. The murder of Father Bison demonstrated how completely violence had become intertwined with ideology. The offenders were no longer simply killing. They were constructing messages through murder. Each crime scene became a form of propaganda. Each victim became part of a narrative Ludwig wanted society to see. And yet the violence was still escalating. The murders had already spread fear across northern Italy. Soon, Ludwig would move beyond targeting individuals entirely. The next stage threatened mass casualties. On May 14, 1983, the offenders carried out one of the deadliest attacks associated with the case. Their target was the Eros Pornographic Cinema in Milan. The choice of location reflected the same ideological pattern visible throughout the investigation. The venue represented a type of behavior Ludwig condemned. But unlike previous attacks, this operation endangered dozens of people simultaneously. The offenders set the building on fire while people were inside. The consequences were catastrophic. 6 people died. Approximately 40 others suffered injuries. For investigators, the attack represented a critical turning point. Until now, Ludwig had primarily been viewed as a serial murder case. The Eros fire forced authorities to confront a new reality. They were dealing with individuals willing to commit mass casualty attacks. The scale of danger had increased dramatically. The possibility of future disasters became impossible to ignore. Public fear intensified. The idea that a mysterious extremist group could enter a crowded venue and ignite a deadly fire challenged assumptions about safety. No longer were only specific individuals at risk. Entire groups of strangers could become victims. Yet astonishingly, Ludwig was not finished. The violence crossed national borders. In January 1984, another fire attack occurred. This time, the location was Munich, Germany. The target was the Liverpool nightclub. The attack once again demonstrated the offender's willingness to endanger large numbers of people. Amid the chaos, a young woman named Corinne Tartarati lost her life. Many others were injured. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Ludwig was growing bolder. The attacks were becoming larger. The potential death toll was increasing. Authorities now faced an urgent challenge. If the offenders remained free, how many more people might die? That question haunted investigators during the early months of 1984. The murders had already claimed multiple lives. The arson attacks had added more victims. And nothing suggested the campaign was ending. In fact, evidence pointed in the opposite direction. The offenders appeared increasingly confident, increasingly ambitious, increasingly dangerous. For nearly 7 years, the mysterious name Ludwig had operated in the shadows. Across northern Italy and beyond, lives had been destroyed. Families had buried loved ones. Communities had struggled to understand why. Investigators had chased fragments of evidence from city to city. And still, the people behind the name remained hidden. But unknown to the public, the final chapter of Ludwig's violent campaign was approaching. Not because the offenders intended to stop. Not because they felt remorse. Not because they abandoned their ideology. The campaign was nearing its end for a much simpler reason. For the first time since the beginning of the killings, someone was about to catch them in the act. And when that happened, the mystery that had terrified northern Italy for years would finally begin to unravel. For nearly 7 years, the investigation into Ludwig unfolded like a puzzle whose pieces appeared to come from entirely different boxes. The victims were different. The crime scenes were different. The methods were different. The locations were different. Yet somewhere beneath those differences, investigators suspected a hidden structure, a pattern, a logic, a connection that could explain why a burned car in Verona, a stabbing in Padua, a murder in Venice, the killing of a sex worker in Vicenza, attacks on priests, and deadly arson incidents in Milan and Munich all seemed to belong to the same dark story. Finding that connection proved extraordinarily difficult. Unlike many criminal investigations, the authorities were not pursuing a suspect with obvious personal motives. There were no family disputes, no inheritance battles, no jealous lovers, no financial schemes. The crimes appeared ideological, and ideological offenders often present unique challenges for investigators because their victims are selected not for who they are personally, but for what they symbolize. This meant traditional investigative approaches frequently reached dead ends. When detectives investigated the murder of Garino Spinelli, they naturally examined his personal life. They searched for enemies, conflicts, people who might have wished him harm. But if the killing had been motivated by ideology rather than personal history, such inquiries could only reveal so much. The same problem emerged in subsequent cases. Luciano Stefanato had his own social circle. Claudio Costa had his own life. Alice Maria Beretta had her own circumstances. The murdered priests belonged to religious communities. The victims occupied entirely different worlds. Initially, there appeared to be little reason to connect them. As a result, investigators often found themselves pursuing separate lines of inquiry. Different police jurisdictions examined different crimes. Different detectives reviewed different evidence. Different cities faced different tragedies. The fragmented nature of the crimes worked in Ludwig's favor. Each attack could appear isolated when viewed on its own. Only when examined collectively did a larger picture begin to emerge. And even then, that picture remained incomplete. One of the greatest challenges facing authorities was the uncertainty surrounding Ludwig itself. Who exactly were they searching for? The question sounds simple. In reality, it was anything but. The name Ludwig generated endless speculation. Some believed the crimes were the work of a lone serial killer. Others suspected a larger extremist organization. The use of neo-Nazi symbolism suggested political motivations. The references to morality and religion suggested fanaticism. The selection of victims suggested vigilantism. The arson attacks suggested terrorism. Each possibility pointed investigators in a different direction. And because no clear offender profile existed, resources were often spread across multiple theories. Could Ludwig consist of several members operating independently? Could it be an underground network with supporters in different cities? Could the crimes be copycat attacks inspired by earlier murders? Authorities could not immediately rule out any of these possibilities. Meanwhile, the offenders continued leaving behind ideological clues. At various crime scenes and communications linked to the case, investigators encountered recurring themes: neo-Nazi imagery, swastikas, declarations about morality, claims regarding punishment, references to God, references to societal decay. Although these messages did not immediately identify the perpetrators, they helped establish something important. The crimes were probably connected. The same ideological language appeared repeatedly. The same themes resurfaced. The same worldview seemed to guide the violence. Gradually, investigators began recognizing Ludwig not as a collection of unrelated incidents, but as a continuing campaign. That realization represented a crucial step forward. A connected series of crimes could be studied as a whole. Patterns could be compared. Timelines could be constructed. Similarities could be identified. The challenge, however, remained enormous. Knowing that the crimes were related did not reveal who committed them. Years passed. Victims accumulated. Fear spread. And Ludwig remained hidden. The public saw only the consequences. Police officers and detectives experienced something else entirely: frustration. Every major investigation reaches moments when progress seems possible, only for new evidence to disappear into uncertainty. The Ludwig case contained many such moments. Each crime scene offered clues, but no clue appeared strong enough to expose the people responsible. The offenders demonstrated caution. They avoided immediate identification. They left behind ideology rather than identity. As a result, investigators often found themselves studying the crimes more closely than the criminals. The murders told a story, but the authors remained anonymous. By the early 1980s, one reality had become increasingly clear. The threat was growing. The attack on the Arrow Cinema in Milan had demonstrated a willingness to cause mass casualties. The fire at the Liverpool nightclub in Munich reinforced that conclusion. Authorities were no longer dealing solely with targeted killings. They were confronting individuals prepared to endanger large crowds. This escalation created additional urgency. The question was no longer simply who Ludwig was. The question was whether investigators could identify them before another disaster occurred. That urgency would ultimately be answered not through years of forensic analysis, not through an informant, and not through a dramatic confession. Instead, the breakthrough came through observation. A simple recognition that something was wrong. A moment that, at the time, may have seemed ordinary, but would ultimately bring one of Italy's most notorious criminal mysteries to an end. The date was March 4th, 1984. The location was Castiglione del Stiviere, specifically the Melamara nightclub. To visitors, the establishment appeared like any other nightlife venue. People arrived expecting entertainment and social interaction. Nobody knew they were about to witness the final operational chapter of Ludwig. Among those entering the venue that day were two men. According to later investigations, they were Wolfgang Abel and Marco Ferlin. Importantly, they were not there as ordinary customers. Authorities would later conclude that they had arrived with a plan. The details discovered afterward painted a disturbing picture. The pair had allegedly entered the nightclub in disguise. More alarming still, they carried gasoline. Investigators later determined that they were in the process of pouring fuel onto the carpets inside the establishment. The implications were terrifying. Nightclubs often contain large numbers of people. Many areas are enclosed. Fire can spread rapidly. Panic can be deadly. If an ignition had occurred under the right circumstances, the result could have been catastrophic. Potentially another mass casualty event. Potentially even worse than previous attacks. But this time something happened that had not occurred during earlier crimes. Someone noticed. The suspicious behavior attracted attention. Employees and security personnel observed actions that appeared unusual. Perhaps it was the behavior itself. Perhaps it was the circumstances. Whatever initially triggered concern, the result proved decisive. Instead of ignoring what they saw, staff intervened. That intervention changed everything. For years, Ludwig had operated in darkness. Now, for the first time, the people behind the mystery faced direct scrutiny. The confrontation prevented the plan from moving forward. Abel and Ferlin were detained before the nightclub could become another deadly fire scene. At that moment, however, nobody fully understood the significance of what had happened. Security personnel may have recognized suspicious behavior. They could not immediately know they had potentially interrupted the activities of one of Italy's most feared criminal entities. The true importance emerged only after police became involved. As authorities investigated the incident, evidence began accumulating. Questions expanded beyond the nightclub itself. Who were these men? Why were they carrying gasoline? Why were they allegedly spreading it across carpets? What had they intended to do? The more investigators examined those questions, the more alarming the answers became. Connections slowly emerged. Evidence from previous Ludwig crimes was revisited. Patterns were compared. Timelines were analyzed. And gradually, authorities began linking the detained suspects to the broader series of murders and arson attacks that had haunted northern Italy for years. The transformation was dramatic. A mystery that had once revolved around an anonymous name suddenly centered on identifiable individuals. Ludwig was no longer merely an idea, no longer merely a symbol, no longer merely a signature appearing after violence. Now investigators had names. Wolfgang Abel, Marco Ferlin. For law enforcement, this represented the breakthrough they had sought for years. For the public, it represented something equally significant. The realization that Ludwig was not an invisible force. It was allegedly two human beings. That revelation shocked many observers. People had spent years imagining what kind of organization could be responsible. Some envisioned large extremist networks. Others imagined sophisticated conspiracies. The possibility that two educated young men from respectable backgrounds stood behind the crimes seemed almost unbelievable. Yet, as the investigation progressed, authorities became increasingly convinced of the connection. News of the arrests spread rapidly. Public reaction was intense. For years, fear and frustration had accumulated throughout affected communities. Many people had followed reports of the murders and arson attacks. Many had watched authorities search unsuccessfully for answers. Now, suddenly, suspects were in custody. The emotional response was immediate. According to reports from the time, public anger became so severe that police had to protect the suspects from the crowd. This reaction reflected more than outrage over individual crimes. It reflected years of fear, years of uncertainty, years during which Ludwig had existed as an unseen threat. Now that threat appeared vulnerable for the first time. The investigation that followed focused on transforming suspicion into evidence. Authorities worked to establish connections between the suspects and the extensive catalog of crimes associated with Ludwig. The challenge remained substantial. The case encompassed multiple murders, multiple cities, multiple years, multiple attack methods. Building a comprehensive picture required patience and detailed analysis. Yet the fundamental reality had changed. Before March 1984, investigators searched for Ludwig. After March 1984, they investigated Wolfgang Abel and Marco Ferlin. The mystery had entered a new phase. Questions about identity were gradually being replaced by questions of proof. Could prosecutors demonstrate responsibility? Could investigators connect the suspects to the entire series? Could the evidence withstand scrutiny in court? Those questions would dominate the next chapter of the case. For nearly 7 years, Ludwig had been a phantom. A name, a threat, a source of fear. Now, for the first time, the phantom had faces. And soon, those faces would appear before a courtroom tasked with deciding whether they were truly responsible for one of the most notorious campaigns of ideological violence in modern Italian history. By the time the Ludwig case reached the courtroom, the mystery that had haunted northern Italy for nearly 7 years had largely been replaced by a different question. The public no longer asked, "Who is Ludwig?" Instead, they asked, "Can the prosecution prove it?" That distinction mattered enormously. An arrest can end uncertainty. A conviction requires evidence. And in a democratic legal system, suspicion alone is never enough. The investigation had produced 2 suspects, Wolfgang Abel and Marco Ferlin. Authorities believed they were the individuals behind the name Ludwig. Investigators had connected them to a series of murders and arson attacks that stretched across multiple cities and several years. Yet the courtroom would become the place where those conclusions faced their greatest challenge. Everything now depended on whether prosecutors could persuade the court that the evidence established responsibility for the crimes attributed to Ludwig. The stakes could hardly have been higher. The case involved multiple murders, involved deadly fires. It involved ideological violence. It involved attacks that had terrified entire communities. For the families of victims, the upcoming proceedings represented something deeply important. Not closure, because true closure rarely exists after violent loss, but accountability. An opportunity to see those accused of causing so much suffering answer before the law. The trial began in late 1986. By that point, Ludwig had already become one of the most infamous criminal cases in modern Italian history. Public interest was enormous. The media followed developments closely. Journalists examined every new detail. Observers attempted to understand how such a lengthy and violent campaign could allegedly have been carried out by 2 individuals who, at least outwardly, had appeared ordinary. That question remained central throughout the proceedings. The image of the accused contrasted sharply with the image many people held of violent offenders. Neither man resembled the stereotypical criminal mastermind often portrayed in popular culture. Neither came from a background traditionally associated with organized crime. Instead, they were educated young men from relatively privileged environments. The contrast disturbed many observers. If the allegations were true, then the Ludwig case challenged a comforting assumption. The assumption that extreme violence always emerges from obvious sources. The prosecution's task was straightforward in principle, though enormously complex in practice. Prosecutors sought to demonstrate that Abel and Ferlin were responsible for the crimes attributed to Ludwig. This meant presenting a coherent picture of a campaign that stretched across years and involved multiple victims. The challenge was not merely proving a single homicide. The challenge was explaining an entire pattern of violence. Investigators had long argued that the various murders and arson attacks were connected by ideology. The prosecution emphasized this pattern. Victims from different social groups had allegedly been selected according to the same worldview. Drug users, homosexuals, sex workers, priests. The crimes appeared linked not by personal relationships, but by a shared system of beliefs. The repeated ideological themes associated with Ludwig formed an important part of the broader narrative presented by authorities. The prosecution argued that these crimes were not random. They were purposeful. They reflected a consistent logic. A distorted logic, certainly, but a consistent one. That consistency, prosecutors argued, helped connect incidents that might otherwise appear unrelated. The murders of individual victims, the attacks on religious figures, the deadly fires. Together, they formed a larger story. A story investigators believed pointed toward Abel and Ferlin. The defense, however, presented a very different picture. From the beginning, both men denied responsibility. Their position remained clear. They insisted they were innocent. According to the information available from the case, they argued that investigators had reached the wrong conclusions. More significantly, they claimed that evidence had been fabricated. Such allegations transformed the proceedings into more than a debate about individual crimes. They became a dispute over the reliability of the investigation itself. The defense challenged the narrative presented by authorities. If the evidence could not be trusted, then the prosecution's broader theory would also come into question. These arguments ensured that the courtroom became the central battleground in determining the future of the case. As proceedings continued, another significant issue emerged: mental health. Psychiatric experts became involved in evaluating the accused. Their assessments introduced additional complexity into an already extraordinary trial. The central question was not whether the crimes had occurred. The deaths were real. The fires were real. The suffering was real. Instead, psychiatric evaluations focused on the mental condition of the defendants. According to reports from the case, experts identified significant psychological disturbances. The findings generated considerable discussion. How should the justice system respond when serious violence intersects with mental health concerns? Could psychological abnormalities explain the crimes? Did such conditions affect responsibility? What role should these evaluations play in determining punishment? These questions are never simple. Courts frequently confront the difficult task of balancing accountability with psychiatric evidence. The Ludwig trial proved no exception. For the families of victims, these discussions may have seemed distant from the realities they experienced. Their loved ones remained dead regardless of psychiatric conclusions. Their losses remained permanent. Yet legal systems require courts to consider all relevant factors. As a result, psychiatric testimony became an important component of the proceedings. Throughout the trial, the public continued following developments closely. The case had evolved beyond an ordinary criminal prosecution. It had become a national examination of extremism, violence, morality, and responsibility. People wanted answers. How had Ludwig emerged? Why had the killings continued for so long? Could similar crimes happen again? The courtroom could not answer every question, but it could address one crucial issue: whether Abel and Ferlin should be held criminally responsible. Eventually, the proceedings reached their conclusion. In 1987, the court delivered its verdict. Wolfgang Abel and Marco Ferlin were convicted. The decision represented the culmination of years of investigation and months of legal argument. For prosecutors, the verdict validated the extensive effort devoted to linking the suspects to the Ludwig crimes. For the victims' families, it provided official recognition that the justice system accepted responsibility had been established. For the public, it marked the end of one chapter in a story that had begun nearly a decade earlier with the death of Guerino Spinelli. The court imposed sentences of 30 years imprisonment. Given the scale of the case, many observers viewed the outcome through different lenses. Some focused on the convictions themselves. Others examined the influence of psychiatric findings on sentencing. Still others reflected on the broader implications of the verdict. What mattered most, however, was that the legal process had reached a conclusion, at least temporarily, because the Ludwig case did not end with the initial judgment. As often occurs in major criminal proceedings, appeals followed. The appellate process re-examined aspects of the case and ultimately resulted in a modification of the sentences. The original 30-year terms were reduced to 27 years. Sentence reductions frequently generate debate in high-profile cases. Supporters of victims may view them as inadequate. Legal experts may emphasize procedural considerations. The Ludwig case was no exception. Yet regardless of the adjustment, the essential outcome remained unchanged. The convictions stood. The court's finding of guilt remained in place. The men identified as Ludwig would spend decades behind bars. Even so, the story refused to end quietly. Several years after the convictions, another dramatic development occurred. In 1991, Marco Ferlin escaped and fled to Greece. The escape attracted considerable attention for a case that had already generated years of headlines. The possibility of a convicted offender avoiding imprisonment raised immediate concern. Authorities launched efforts to locate him. The situation persisted for several years. Then, in 1995, Ferlin was captured. His recapture restored the legal outcome established by the courts and closed another unexpected chapter in the Ludwig saga. Yet despite the convictions, despite the years of imprisonment, and despite the extensive legal proceedings, one aspect of the case remained remarkably consistent. Neither Abel nor Ferlin accepted responsibility. Both continued to maintain their innocence. Both continued to argue that the investigation had been flawed. Both continued to insist that evidence had been fabricated. This persistence is notable because criminal cases often produce some form of acknowledgement, expression of regret, or acceptance over time. In the Ludwig case, that acknowledgement never arrived. The convictions resolved the legal question. They did not resolve every dispute surrounding the case. As a result, competing narratives continued to exist. The courts had reached one conclusion. The convicted men maintained another. For victims' families, however, the debate over responsibility existed alongside a far more painful reality. Their loved ones would never return. No verdict could reverse that fact. No sentence could erase years of grief. No courtroom decision could undo the violence that had occurred. The legal process can establish accountability. It cannot restore lost lives. Still, the trial represented a turning point. For years, Ludwig had existed primarily as fear, a mysterious name attached to violence, a phantom moving through northern Italy. The courtroom transformed that phantom into defendants. Evidence replaced rumor. Legal arguments replaced speculation. Judicial decisions replaced uncertainty. The transition mattered because societies depend on institutions capable of confronting violence through law rather than vengeance. The public anger surrounding the case had been intense. Many people wanted answers. Many wanted punishment. The trial provided a structured process through which those demands could be examined according to legal standards rather than emotion alone. By the end of the proceedings, the mysterious era of Ludwig had officially entered history. The crimes would never be forgotten. The victims would never be forgotten. But the anonymous force that had once seemed impossible to identify now had names, convictions, and prison sentences attached to it. The next chapter would focus not on the investigation or the courtroom, but on what remained afterward. Because even after a verdict is delivered and prison doors close, the consequences of a case like Ludwig continue for decades. For survivors, for families, for communities, and for a nation left to confront the uncomfortable reality that some of its most notorious acts of ideological violence had allegedly been carried out not by monsters from the shadows, but by two educated young men who believed they had the right to decide who deserved to live. When people think about notorious criminal cases, they often focus on the moments of violence. The murders, the investigations, the arrests, the courtroom drama. Those events naturally attract attention because they are dramatic and immediate. They create headlines. They dominate public conversation. They become the parts of a story that are most frequently remembered. Yet the aftermath of a crime is often far longer than the crime itself. The violence associated with Ludwig unfolded over a period of nearly 7 years. The consequences have lasted for decades. Long after investigators completed their work. Long after reporters moved on to other stories. Long after courtrooms emptied. The victims remained gone. Their families continued living with loss. And Italy was left to examine one of the most disturbing criminal episodes in its modern history. By the time the legal process had run its course, Wolfgang Abel and Marco Ferlin had become permanently linked to the name Ludwig. The mysterious identity that had once frightened entire communities no longer existed as an unsolved question. The courts had reached their conclusions. The defendants had received prison sentences. The case, at least from a legal perspective, appeared settled. But time has a way of changing even the most infamous stories. Years became decades. The fear that once dominated newspaper headlines gradually faded into history. New crimes captured public attention. New generations grew up without directly experiencing the atmosphere that Ludwig had created during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Yet the passage of time did not erase the case. Instead, it transformed it into something different. A historical warning. A subject of study. A reminder of how extremist beliefs can evolve into violence. The first major chapter of the aftermath concerned imprisonment. Both Abel and Ferlin spent decades behind bars. For the victims' families, those years represented the practical consequence of the convictions delivered in 1987. The prison sentences ensured that the men found responsible for the Ludwig crimes would spend a substantial portion of their lives in custody. During that period, public attention gradually diminished. This is common in major criminal cases. The trial generates enormous interest. The years afterward often unfold quietly. Yet behind that quiet passage of time remained unresolved questions. How should society remember Ludwig? As a serial murder case? As ideological violence? As domestic terrorism? As a warning about extremism? Different observers emphasize different aspects. What nobody disputed was the scale of suffering left behind. Every victim represented an absence that could never be filled. Families lost sons. Communities lost members. Religious institutions lost clergy. Friends lost people they cared about. The public discussion often focused on the perpetrators. The private reality centered on those who never returned home. Eventually, the prison years began reaching their conclusion. Wolfgang Abel ultimately completed approximately 32 years of imprisonment and supervision before gaining full freedom in 2016. The figure itself is striking. 32 years. An entire generation. A period long enough for societies to change, technologies to transform daily life, and children to become adults. When Abel left the correctional system, the world was vastly different from the one that existed when Ludwig first emerged. The Italy of 2016 was not the Italy of 1977. Yet despite the passage of time, the name Ludwig remained part of the historical record. Marco Ferlin was also eventually released. Like Abel, he left prison after decades connected to one of Italy's most notorious criminal investigations. And like Abel, he continued to deny responsibility. This fact remained one of the most unusual elements of the case's aftermath. Throughout the investigation, throughout the trial, throughout the appeals process, and throughout the years that followed, the convicted men maintained their innocence. They continued arguing that the evidence had been fabricated. They continued rejecting the conclusions reached by investigators and courts. For some observers, these denials represented an attempt to avoid responsibility. For others, they became part of the ongoing controversy surrounding the case. Whatever interpretation one chooses, the denials ensured that the Ludwig story never acquired the type of final confession sometimes associated with major criminal investigations. No moment of public acknowledgement arrived. No comprehensive explanation emerged from the convicted men. No expression of responsibility brought additional clarity to the victims' families. The convictions answered legal questions. Some emotional and philosophical questions remained unresolved. Another significant moment in the aftermath occurred years later. In 2024, Wolfgang Abel died at the age of 65. Reports indicated that he had spent years in a coma following a severe head injury before his death. With that event, one of the two men associated with Ludwig became part of history in a different way. His death inevitably renewed public discussion about the case. Whenever a major figure connected to a notorious crime dies, society often revisits the events that made the individual famous. Old questions resurface. Old memories return. People once again examine what happened and why. The death of Abel prompted exactly that kind of reflection. Not because his passing changed the facts of the case. The victims remained the central tragedy. Rather, it reminded observers how much time had passed since the first murder in 1977. Nearly half a century. Few criminal cases continue attracting attention for that long. Ludwig remains one of them. But why? What exactly makes this case endure in public memory when so many others gradually disappear? Part of the answer lies in the offenders themselves. Many notorious murder cases involve individuals who lived on the margins of society. Ludwig challenged that expectation. According to investigators and court findings, the people behind the crimes were educated young men from relatively privileged backgrounds. This fact continues to unsettle people. There is comfort in believing danger always looks obvious. The Ludwig case suggests otherwise. Another reason involves ideology. The violence was not motivated by financial gain. It was not driven by robbery. It was not primarily about personal disputes. Instead, authorities concluded that the crimes were connected to an extremist worldview. The offenders allegedly believed they possessed the right to determine who deserved to live. History repeatedly demonstrates the dangers of such thinking, whether political, religious, or social in nature. Ideologies become dangerous when they begin dividing humanity into categories of value. Once that division occurs, violence becomes easier to justify. The Ludwig case provides a powerful example of this process. The victims were not targeted because of who they were individually. They were targeted because they represented groups the offenders condemned. That distinction remains one of the most important lessons of the case. Extremist violence often begins with labels. People stop being individuals. They become symbols. And once human beings are reduced to symbols, cruelty becomes easier to rationalize. Another reason Ludwig remains significant is the diversity of its victims. Drug users, homosexuals, sex workers, priests. The range is remarkable. Most serial murder cases involve a relatively specific victim profile. Ludwig appeared different. The offender's ideology created an unusually broad list of potential targets. This made the threat unpredictable. Anyone falling outside the offender's moral framework could potentially become a victim. That unpredictability contributed significantly to public fear. Communities struggled to understand who might be targeted next. The murders seemed to expand rather than narrow. The danger appeared to grow over time, which leads to another important reason the case remains memorable: escalation. Many violent offenders repeat similar patterns. Ludwig evolved. The campaign moved from individual murders to attacks capable of producing mass casualties. The fire at the Arrow Cinema. The fire at the Liverpool nightclub. These incidents demonstrated a willingness to endanger large numbers of strangers. The progression revealed how extremist violence can intensify when left unchecked. What begins as targeted attacks can develop into broader acts of terror. The Ludwig story illustrates that progression with frightening clarity. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson lies not in the offenders, but in the victims. True crime narratives often risk creating an imbalance. The perpetrators become famous. The victims become footnotes, names buried beneath details of investigations and trials. But the reality of Ludwig is measured not by the notoriety of Abel and Ferlin. It is measured by the lives that ended. Garino Spinelli, Luciano Stefanato, Claudio Costa, Alice Maria Beretta, the priests of Monte Barrico, Father Armando Bison, the victims of the arson attacks, the injured survivors, the families forever changed. They're the true legacy of the case. Everything else exists around them. The investigation mattered because victims deserved justice. The trial mattered because victims deserved accountability. The historical significance matters because victims deserve remembrance. When viewed through that lens, Ludwig becomes more than a criminal case. It becomes a cautionary story. A story about the dangers of fanaticism. A story about the consequences of dehumanization. A story about what can happen when people convince themselves that murder serves a moral purpose. For nearly 7 years, northern Italy searched for a phantom called Ludwig. The name appeared after murders, after fires, after acts of cruelty that left communities frightened and confused. People imagined organizations, networks, conspiracies. What investigators ultimately uncovered was something arguably more disturbing. The violence did not emerge from an enormous hidden movement. It emerged, according to the courts, from two educated young men who believed they possessed the authority to judge other human beings. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable lesson of all. The greatest dangers are not always the easiest to recognize. Sometimes they wear ordinary faces. Sometimes they speak the language of morality. Sometimes they claim to be protecting society. Yet beneath those claims can exist hatred, intolerance, and violence. The victims of Ludwig paid the highest possible price for that reality. Their lives became part of a case that continues to be remembered decades later. Not because the perpetrators deserve fascination. Not because the ideology deserves attention. But because remembering the victims reminds us what was truly lost. The story of Ludwig began with fire, fear, and mystery. It ended with arrests, convictions, and decades of imprisonment. But its final meaning lies elsewhere. In the recognition that every victim was a human being. Every life mattered. And every act of violence committed in the name of ideology leaves wounds that continue long after. The killers themselves have faded into history. The victims are remembered. The suffering is remembered. The warning remains. And that is where the story of Ludwig finally comes to an end. Years after the final court rulings, years after the prison sentences, and years after the fear that once gripped northern Italy had faded from daily life, the name Ludwig continued to occupy a strange place in the country's collective memory. Unlike many criminal cases that eventually disappear into archives, Ludwig endured. It remained the subject of documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, criminal studies, and discussions about ideological violence. The reason was not simply the number of victims. Italy has witnessed other notorious crimes. Nor was it solely the brutality of the murders, although the violence associated with Ludwig was undeniably shocking. What made the case so enduring was the unsettling combination of factors that seemed to defy easy explanation. The perpetrators were not impoverished drifters. They were not members of a traditional criminal organization. They were not driven by financial gain. According to investigators and court findings, they were educated young men who adopted an extremist worldview and transformed that worldview into a justification for violence. For many people, that reality remains difficult to comprehend. Society often prefers simple explanations. It is easier to understand crimes motivated by greed. It is easier to understand crimes motivated by revenge. It is easier to understand crimes that emerge from obvious personal conflicts. The Ludwig case offered none of those comforts. Instead, it forced observers to confront a more troubling possibility: that ordinary individuals can become capable of extraordinary cruelty when ideology convinces them that other human beings are less worthy of life. Throughout history, extremist movements have often depended upon a process of dehumanization. The process is rarely complicated. It begins by dividing the world into categories. Some people are declared virtuous. Others are declared corrupt. Some are viewed as valuable. Others are portrayed as threats. Once those divisions become accepted, violence becomes easier to justify. The victims cease being individuals. They become symbols. Labels replace names. Human beings become targets. In the Ludwig case, investigators concluded that this process played a central role in the crimes. The victims came from different walks of life. Some struggled with addiction. Some belonged to marginalized communities. Some worked in professions condemned by the offenders. Some were members of the clergy. Despite these differences, the victims shared one tragic characteristic. They had been categorized by Ludwig's ideology. Their humanity had been reduced to labels. Their individuality had been ignored. Their lives had been judged according to standards they never chose and could never challenge. This aspect of the case remains particularly important because it demonstrates how ideological violence operates. The offenders did not need personal relationships with their victims. They did not need personal grudges. They did not need direct conflicts. The victim's existence within certain groups was apparently enough. That fact transformed Ludwig from a series of murders into something larger. It became an example of how abstract beliefs can produce real-world suffering. For criminologists and historians, the case continues to provide valuable lessons. One lesson concerns warning signs. Extremist violence rarely appears without context. It often develops gradually. Beliefs become more rigid. Moral judgments become more absolute. Opponents become enemies. Enemies become targets. The progression may take years, but the pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. The Ludwig crimes illustrate that progression in a particularly stark form. Another lesson involves assumptions about who commits violent acts. Public imagination often associates dangerous offenders with recognizable stereotypes. Yet the Ludwig case challenged those stereotypes. The men ultimately convicted in connection with the crimes came from backgrounds that many would have considered respectable. This reality serves as a reminder that education alone does not prevent extremism. Social status alone does not prevent extremism. Privilege alone does not prevent extremism. Dangerous ideas can emerge in many environments. They are not limited to any single social class or community. Perhaps the most significant lesson, however, concerns the victims themselves. Modern discussions of notorious crimes sometimes focus so heavily on perpetrators that victims become secondary characters in their own stories. The danger of this approach is that it can unintentionally distort the true meaning of a case. Ludwig was never ultimately about Wolfgang Abel or Marco Ferlin. It was about the people whose lives ended because of violence. It was about families forced to receive devastating news. It was about communities trying to understand tragedy. It was about survivors and loved ones carrying grief long after headlines disappeared. Every victim represented a future that never arrived. Every victim left behind relationships, memories, and unfinished plans. The passage of time does not change that reality. Decades may separate the present from the crimes, but the consequences remain woven into the lives of those affected. This is one reason why remembrance matters. Remembering victims is not merely an act of historical record. It is a rejection of the dehumanization that made the crimes possible in the first place. When victims are remembered as individuals rather than categories, the ideology behind the violence loses its power. Names replace labels. Human stories replace abstract judgments. Dignity replaces hatred. In the years following the case, northern Italy gradually moved forward. The cities connected to the investigation continued evolving. New generations grew up. Many people learned about Ludwig only through books, documentaries, or historical accounts. Yet the story retained its relevance because the underlying issues never disappeared. Extremism still exists. Hatred still exists. Attempts to divide humanity into worthy and unworthy groups still exist. The specific circumstances of Ludwig belong to history, but the broader warning remains contemporary. Every era faces its own forms of intolerance. Every generation must decide whether it will accept dehumanization or resist it. Looking back, it is remarkable how long the mystery endured. For nearly 7 years, authorities pursued an elusive enemy. Citizens read alarming headlines and wondered where Ludwig would strike next. Investigators examined crime scenes, searching for patterns. Fear spread because the threat seemed invisible. When the arrests finally occurred in March 1984, many people experienced relief. Yet relief did not erase what had happened. The victims remained dead. The injured remained scarred. The families remained changed forever. Justice can impose consequences. It cannot restore lost years. It cannot reverse suffering. It cannot bring victims back. What it can do is establish accountability and preserve memory. In that sense, the Ludwig case achieved a form of conclusion without ever achieving complete closure. Some questions were answered. Others were not. The courts reached their verdicts. The convicted men maintained their denials. Historians and researchers continue examining the case from different perspectives. But beneath every debate lies a simple and unchanging truth. Human beings lost their lives. Human beings suffered. Human beings were targeted because others convinced themselves that violence served a higher purpose. That truth remains the heart of the story. As this series comes to an end, it is worth returning to the image that haunted northern Italy for so many years. A single word appearing after acts of violence. Ludwig. For a long time, the name seemed larger than life. It seemed to belong to a hidden force operating beyond ordinary understanding. Eventually, investigators uncovered the people they believed stood behind it. The mystery was solved. The fear subsided. The years passed. Yet the case continues to echo because it asks a question that extends far beyond one country or one era. What happens when human beings become so convinced of their own righteousness that they stop seeing the humanity of others? The answer can be found throughout the Ludwig case. It can be found in every victim. It can be found in every act of violence. And it can be found in every lesson the story leaves behind. The name Ludwig may belong to history, but the warning remains timeless. Remember the victims. Remember the consequences of hatred. Remember the danger of ideologies that divide people into categories of worth. And remember that behind every true crime story are real lives whose value cannot be measured by the circumstances of their deaths. That, more than anything else, is the lasting legacy of Ludwig.